Well, joining me now from Medford, Massachusetts in the U.S. is Sung-Yoon Lee. He's a professor of Korean studies at Tufts University. He's also appeared as an expert witness at a congressional hearing on North Korea policy. In Washington, D.C., we have Will Saetren. He's a research associate and program officer at the Institute for China-America Studies. And completing our panel is Victor Gao in Beijing. He's the director of the China National Association of International Studies. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Will Saetren, good to have you on the program. I understand it's the first time you're on the Newsmakers. Tell me what this means, this meeting between Kim and Xi. What does it tell you?
Well, first of all, it tells me that the Chinese-North Korean alliance is stronger than we suspected. It had been declining pretty precipitously for a number of years. There were a lot of speculations that these relations had gone very sour. And it was clear that it was important both to Pyongyang and to Beijing to show the world that those ties are much stronger than people had speculated that they were. I saw this meeting as a big loss for the United States. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the White House press secretary, admitted that the White House was not notified until after the fact. And the illusion that the Trump administration has tried to paint that they are in charge, that they are driving the narrative, and the peace process on the Korean Peninsula, I think was pretty decisively shattered.
Okay, so Professor Lee, is this a sidelining of the Americans as the Chinese re-inject themselves into this process?
It's simply the restoration of China to its proper role in the region, which is really the center, the middle kingdom running the show. And the fact that it took Kim Jong-un 6 years to visit Beijing is rather meaningless. It took his father, Kim Jong-il, also 6 years for his first visit to Beijing to happen, into his rule, that is. Why? Because the timing is now optimal for a visit to China. After having established its credibility last year with 3 ICBM tests and the most powerful nuclear test to date for North Korea, Kim has reset the table and is now well poised to beckon, to summon the world's biggest powers to come to Pyongyang or to greet him and treat him as a global statesman. So nothing's really changed in terms of the basic dynamics in the region, with North Korea calling the shots through a strategy of calculated provocations and then de-escalation.
Okay, so Victor Gao, what we're hearing from Sung-Yoon Lee is that actually it's not China calling the shots, it's not anybody else dictating the tempo here, it's actually the North Koreans who are doing this in a very calculated way, and we've seen this happen before. Is that how you see it?
No, I think, first of all, we need to look at the positive development on the Korean Peninsula. ROK and DPRK are now working closer to each other, and there is the announced, proposed meeting between between DPRK leader and President Donald Trump of the United States. But what happened in Beijing is very significant. Why? Because for about 2 years, China has consistently called for dialogue and negotiation and opposed any threat of war. And China also insisted that China will not tolerate any war on its doorstep. I think it's absolutely important to note that China has made the right decision, has made the right proposal, and parties involved are now more or less moving in the same direction that China charted. That is that we are all moving towards dialogue and peace. We do not want to find ourselves in a situation where everyone wants to take credit. If peace prevails, everyone can get a credit.
Okay, let's find out from Will if he believes that we are moving towards more peace here. I mean, is the prospect of a nuclear confrontation or any other confrontation less of a possibility now that the Chinese are meeting with Kim Jong-un in Beijing and they're talking?
I don't know if it's less of a possibility. I think it's been a bad option the entire way. If you remember a couple months ago when Steve Bannon was fired from the White House, right before his ouster, he was quoted as having said, people who talk about a military strike on North Korea, forget about it. They've got us. It's not an option. So I don't think the situation has changed all that much. Quite frankly, a lot of what happens is going to be up to North Korea. I think a lot remains to be seen about how sincere they are about these talks. They could just be stalling. They could just be buying time to solidify their nuclear program behind the scenes, even if they freeze testing of the missiles and of the nuclear weapons themselves.
Okay, so to the point of sincerity, Sung-Yoon Lee, let me ask you about what you think about what Kim Jong-un had said. This was according to Xinhua, quoted according to Xinhua, saying, "It is our consistent stand to be committed to denuclearization on the peninsula in accordance with the will of the late President Kim Il-sung, his grandfather, and late General Secretary Kim Jong-il, his father." Do you believe him?
I absolutely believe him, and that is denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, the great resolve of his father and grandfather. That means, in North Korean parlance, dislodging the U.S. extended nuclear deterrence from the region, meaning abrogation of the U.S. ROK alliance and the withdrawal of U.S. troops from South Korea, and the abrogation of the U.S.-Japan alliance and the withdrawal, the eviction of all U.S. troops from Japan as well. That's what denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula means. Note how no one says denuclearization of North Korea. It's always the Korean Peninsula. There are no nukes in the South.
Right? Very fascinating. Okay, so Victor Gao, what we hear from China a lot of the time is that the Chinese don't want to see North Korea collapse because obviously they don't want a flood of refugees across the border. It would be tremendously destabilizing and so forth. But beyond that, is it a little bit deeper? Do the Chinese not want a collapse of North Korea because that would mean that an entire Korean peninsula under the hegemony of the United States, under the protective umbrella of the United States, as we have the South right now?
No, I think China has no selfish vested interest in the development on the Korean Peninsula. What China stands for is a very noble and a very esteemed position. That is, there should be no war, there should be no military confrontation on the Korean Peninsula, there should be peace and stability prevailing for the benefit of the people in DPRK as well as in ROK, and for the overall benefit of all the countries concerned in this part of the world and beyond. I think this is probably the best and the noblest objective we can think about as far as the Korean situation is concerned. China, given its size and extra importance on the global stage, we are not only thinking about our own national interest, we most likely will think about our own national interest in the overall context of global interest. And on the Korean situation, it's exactly the case in point, because what China has advocated over the past 2 years, the two suspensions, for example, for DPRK to suspend its nuclear testing, for the United States and ROK to suspend their joint military exercises, at least worked till now. And hopefully this will be the direction to go for both DPRK on the one hand and ROK and the United States on the other hand.
Professor Lee, let me ask you if you agree with that China stands for a noble, or from rather, works from a noble and esteemed position. That's what Victor Gao said. Do you believe him?
Well, it's been a constant message over the past 25 years of the North Korean nuclear saga. China always counsels patience, for God's sake, no war. Let's return to dialogue and maintain the peace in the region. In truth, of course, there has been de facto peace in the Korean Peninsula since the end of the Korean War in 1953, whereas if you look at the 65 or so year period leading up to the outbreak of the war in 1950, there are 4 major wars in and around the Korean Peninsula. If I were a space alien observing the situation, I would really think that Kim Jong-un is, as Trump once called him, a smart cookie. He's doing very well with the cards that he's been dealt. He is able to really negotiate with and prevail over the world's biggest powers. That's quite an achievement.
Right. Will Saetren, beyond the weight and the hairstyles and the funny memes and so on and so forth, a lot of people do say, yes, we underestimate Kim Jong-un. We underestimate North Korea as a rational actor trying to, look out for itself. With that in mind, there's a summit coming up April 27th. If you were called in to counsel South Korea's leadership, if you had to share the room with Moon Jae-in and he said, hey, what should I know about this? What should I keep in mind ahead of this meeting with Kim Jong-un? What would you tell him?
I would tell them absolutely take advantage of any negotiating positions that you can get. That said, I would also say be very cautious of the North Korean leadership and the promises that they make. They have been notoriously unreliable over the decades, backing off on their promises and pledges. That said, the United States is actually guilty of doing some of that as well. The agreed framework agreement collapsed in part because the United States did not deliver on time the light water reactors that they had promised Pyongyang and the food aid. But going back to Sung's point about there having been peace on the Korean Peninsula since 1953, I would disagree with that. There's been an armistice, but there was no official peace treaty. And there have been a lot of cross-border skirmishes. Let's not forget the 2010 sinking of the Cheonan. You know, this is a big deal. You've had artillery strikes across the border from North Korea on South Korean property. So I think that's a little bit of a strong term. But beyond the Moon Jae-in meeting and how I would advise him, I think the real question is how Trump is going to handle his meeting with Kim Jong-un.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Rex Tillerson was just fired. He was just fired weeks ago. And this is the man whose job it is to inform Donald Trump ahead of this meeting and advise him on how it's supposed to go. And he replaced him with Mike Pompeo, and he is about to hire John Bolton.
Right.
So I'm
John
not
Bolton,
very optimistic about that.
So let me take John Bolton and ask a final question to both Sung-Yoon Lee and Victor Gao. Let me start with Victor Gao. John Bolton, as Trump's national security advisor, is he the wrong hawk at the wrong time, or is he someone who could make a difference? Victor Gao, from the Chinese perspective first, before we go to Medford, Massachusetts. Victor Gao.
John Bolton is very much disliked in many parts of the world, and his position on threatening to use force should put him in a very dangerous position. He probably is a threat to global peace and stability, and I hope he will not mislead the United States in the wrong direction. I sincerely believe the American people also want to have peace and development. They do not want to see their own brothers and sisters' lives lost on the Korean Peninsula again.
Okay, Sung-Yoon Lee, John Bolton, is he going to make things more difficult when it comes to trying to find a solution to this problem?
More than John Bolton, Kim Jong-un is the real threat to peace and security in the region and in the world. Bolton has a character issue. He tends to go berserk, freak out, lose his temper, which is not helpful. But when you compare Bolton's argument that preemptive strike is a rational, perhaps even an effective option to, let's say, Ash Carter or Bill Perry, former Secretary of Defense, both of them, they co-authored in the Washington Post in July 2006 an op-ed calling for a preemptive strike against North Korea. I think the change in the dynamics today and protracted negotiations and the rubric of diplomacy and illusion of peace will make it exceedingly difficult for Bolton or Trump to even talk about, let alone implement any kind of preemptive strike. And that is a good thing in the short term, but the problem will fester and the North Korean threat will grow bigger and bigger.
Gentlemen, I've enjoyed talking to all of you. We're out of time, but thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Sung-Yoon Lee, Saetren, and Victor Gao. Come back soon.